Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part 4 of the Blue Fox library development series. And in this video, I'm going to go over some new updates I've made to the library. The first biggest change, I think, for the average person who may use this library in the future is going to be the documentation. I did write some markdown files inside this repository to hopefully help people understand how to use this library in a readable way. I've also improved the error types to match the actual Blue Fox API. So I gave some feedback to the team and basically wanted the full API responses in the actual documentation, and they graciously added them in I think it only took them a day, which was pretty nice. So appreciate it, Blue Fox team. Now that I have this, I was able to use the types and actually make the TypeScript types reflect the real documentation. So let me see, the error names match up, which I'll show you guys in the documentation soon, and also the reasons why the error failed match up in the code, which I think is just important because if you use a library like this and you're writing code, you want to know that okay, the error that I got is because of this, and you want to be able to handle that case. Like maybe, retry the error, or maybe you don't want to retry the error because, like the email already exists, for example. So maybe you want to run a different function in your code, right? So it's important to know why things are failing, and this was really helpful getting the full API response information. And then the next change, or I guess addition to this project, was the typing of the WebSocket API. So BlueFox supports WebSockets, and it basically allows you to receive real-time updates whenever some kind of information changes within BlueFox. So for example, if a user signs up for your website and signs up to the mailing list, but then, a week later they unsubscribe from the mailing list, right? You want to be able to react to that change. And oftentimes in your code, you'll write a function that simply unsubscribes them. But what happens if they go through the BlueFox unsubscribe link in your email, right? That's not code that you've written. That hits BlueFox's endpoint. So the only way to actually react to this change without continuously sending them emails after they unsubscribe is to implement webhooks. And so you can do this in plain JavaScript. However, you get no type safety. And webhooks also return a payload. And there's different event types, there's different information. And this can be pretty not difficult to type yourself, but just a little tedious because you have to check the type. You also have to make sure, okay, what data am I getting back? And then, et cetera, et cetera. So what I did was I implemented the types for you, and I added these utility functions that make everything a little bit smoother to work with. And so let's first go ahead with the normal documentation for the client library. And you can see that we have different modules. So we have the overview, which is inside of this api.md folder. We have the email module, which deals with the sending of emails, of course. Subscriber, which is basically like the user management for BlueFox, and then webhook. And then we have this quick start information, some API coverage, which is there's pretty much full API coverage at this point in the library. But yeah, and then a little bit more information down here for the readers. But I'm gonna skip over that stuff because I'm explaining, this is a video. You guys are watching the video, so I'm not gonna explain everything. But let's go to the documentation. So the API overview, basically some good getting started information, some client configuration information, and different module examples. Here's an example of how to handle errors within the library. And I kind of copied Rust result types in this instance. We have an OK variant, and then we have an error variant. And I'll put an image up on the screen right now of the actual TypeScript type, which is actually pretty simple how it works. And so because TypeScript is pretty flexible, we can also enforce certain cases, right? So if the result is true, and which means okay, then this code will always run. If it's not, then the error case comes back. And when the error case comes back, you're guaranteed to get some kind of error information. BlueFox errors are always thrown, or sorry, not thrown, they're always returned and passed back. Sometimes they throw, usually in validators, because the validator literally needs to ensure that the data is correct, or else, you could reach an unexpected state, right? So the validators always throw. But as far as API errors, if you send, let's say you send in look at this example right here. Like you send in an email, you pass in transaction ID and you have the data. Let's just say you send in some invalid data, but it's technically correct from the type system perspective, then you'll get back a BlueFox error, but it will not throw. And that way you can handle that case yourself in your own application logic. However, if you don't pass in the required data to this actual function, then it'll just outright throw, so that the request never goes to BlueFox, which I think makes sense. And then we also have the error codes, which, like I said earlier, match up exactly with the API responses. So validate error, we have it right there, validate error. And this is just again to make type safety a little bit easier within the library. And then we also have a pretty cool feature called request interceptors. And request interceptors basically run before the request, and the response, like it sounds, runs after the response. And I think these are pretty cool because maybe you want to do some kind of analytics, or you want to have some kind of logic run before and after your request, and you can control that if you want. They are optional. So if you want to do that, you can simply create a function. You have some options to work with, like basically the request information, and you can do something here and return the request object. Next, we have the email API, which, like I've showed in other videos, is pretty much the same. The main thing I changed from last videos is that the send triggered email now accepts an array of emails to kind of match up with the BlueFox API. You can see here, let's go to the JavaScript example. You can see we're passing in an array of email IDs. In the last video, you can only pass in one email. Now, transactional emails, you can only send one at a time as far as I'm aware. And the documentation even reflects that. In all the examples, it's only one email, so I'm going to do it like that. So next we have the subscriber API, and this API mainly has not really changed. The most notable change to this API is the types. So some of the types for subscribers I definitely got wrong. For example, if I scroll down, we can see the subscriber type. Here's some information it receives, it returns. So for example, when you run the, where's the command? Run the get subscriber, get one. This function, this function is right here, the get one subscriber. When you run this, it returns this subscriber interface down here. And before, every subscriber function returned this interface. However, that's not really accurate to the API because the get subscribers, which is the list function, returns this object. It returns items, which are the subscribers, and then the count. So I just kind of made sure that the types again match up with the return type. And it was a lot easier to do this with the API response information. So again, thank you, BlueFox team. And then the subscriber status is just typed in an enum to make it a little bit easier to ensure you're not just passing around raw string. Lastly, and the coolest part, I think, is the webhooks. So webhooks have a bunch of types, is it sent, is it failed, click, open, bounce, etc. And here's a really basic version of how you handle webhooks. So imagine you have, let's say, an Express endpoint or some kind of backend API. You get a request and you pass the request to this handle webhooks function. Now what you do is you first need to validate the webhook. And this actually comes from the BlueFox documentation. And this is about as far as they take it in their documentation, which is fine. But you basically validate it and then kind of do something with the request, right? Now that's up to you with what you want to do with it. But here we take it a step farther. So we pass in the valid API keys, and this is optional. By default, the library under the hood uses your API key that you pass inside the client as the primary API key. Now, the reason you can override and you can pass in other API keys is because BlueFox has an example where you can rotate API keys. So let's say, for example, you have, webhooks in production, right? And you create a new API key because you want to delete the old one. Well, you don't want any downtime. So what you do is you create a new API key, you push the new API key to production. So now you have two in production, then you delete the old one. And this doesn't break the code because you're using an array and you're searching for, if the current webhook API key, which you set inside of the BlueFox dashboard, you make sure that that points to the new API key once it's in production. So to support that feature, we have this array that you can pass in for a key rotation right here. Next, after that, you're going to parse the event that comes through. And really what this does is this is a helper function that simply checks the type of the event and returns TypeScript objects depending on the event type, which you can see you can access right here. And again, this is all pretty much modeled after these payloads that are returned, right? And then you can do something with the event and return a response because webhooks hit HTTP post endpoint. Now, what I recommend someone really do is simply use this utility function called handle webhook. And this handle webhook function calls the validation logic and the parse webhook event under the hood. So if you don't need to do any complicated API key logic and you just want to handle some webhooks very simply, you can use this function. So a really cool thing, let me see if I have let me see. Okay, the type isn't in this documentation, but actually, let me find the type for you guys real quick. Okay, here it is. So if I go to, we go to handle webhook options, you can see this is the options for this function. We can see in this handler. So we take in a request, API key override, valid API keys, and then we have this handler object. And this object contains a key of functions that are defined based on their webhook event type. And again, these types are based on the documentation. So the cool thing about this is that you can literally, let's go back to the documentation. You can literally build typed functions based on the type of event you want to handle. So whenever a webhook gets called, it's going to, it basically acts as a typed switch statement. So it's going to say, okay, let's see what type this webhook is. Okay, whatever function matches this type, we're going to pass it here and allow you to handle it. And I think this is really, really powerful because it just saves you so much time and you can guarantee that you have the correct data, right? And yeah, I really recommend that everyone use this function if you're going to use BlueFox in this library because it's so helpful. We also have type guards, which is another utility that I added. So you can see client.webhooks.isClickEvent, is open event, is subscription event. This is just an easy way to say, okay, is this event the event that I want? And, this can be helpful in certain control flow situations, although it's not super really required if you are using the handlers logic because the only handlers that will run are the ones that you define. So you don't really have to check the type of event if you're, say, writing logic in this open function, right? Because it will only be called if the open event is triggered. So, and yeah, here's the rest of the type guards that have been implemented in the library. So yeah, I think I'll end the video here, guys. I appreciate you watching part 4 of the library. So far, everything has been really great. This has been a really fun project to work on. I've gotten a lot better at model repos and even just learning more about TypeScript types, and the type system is really great. It feels like a functional programming language, which is pretty cool. I'm not sure when I'll make part 5. Part 5 will probably be when I release the library version 1.0 because at this point, the library is pretty much implemented. I just have to finish testing everything and cleaning up everything for publishing and making sure there's no bugs. So I appreciate you guys for watching and tune in for future videos.